I trained as a teacher, believe it or not. And whilst I was training, my brother, who is a few years younger than me, was leaving school, and he found out about the BBC, and decided he'd go and work for the BBC. I came home one weekend from college, teacher training college, and found all this information. I thought, well, I'd rather do that than teach. So, cut a long story short, I finished my course and then joined the BBC after him. So we both ended up as camera assistants, first of all. And then I was a cameraman for about 9 years, and then moved through to the lighting department. I decided that that was really where I wanted to be, because my grandfather was, he had stage lighting as his hobby, and he'd used my brother and myself to help him, sliding these great big resistor dimmers up and down in the plays and musicals and things at the local church hall and the local town hall. So yeah, I got bitten by the lighting bug way back as a kid. So yes, moved across to the lighting department at the BBC, and I was what they called a vision operator back then, which was basically the person who racks the cameras. I did that for about 18 months and then moved across and became a console operator, which in the BBC days was called lighting vision supervisor. Did that for 4 or 5 years and then became a lighting director. That was, I think, back in about 1990. And the great thing back then was it was all still staff. There were no freelancers. There were no independent production companies coming in. So we were all still being trained properly. BBC was very much looking long term with everybody. So there was lots of training and there was lots of career development. And I ended up being put onto programs as varied as EastEnders and Top of the Pops, and everybody did Blue Peter, and I did a few sitcoms and all sorts of stuff, really. So it was a fantastic experience and training right through the 1990s, and then I decided to jump ship and go freelance in 2002, and that's where I am now. So the great thing about going freelance was that I was then able to work in all sorts of other studios, as well as Television Centre and the other BBC studios. And that was when I started to become interested in the history of the studios, including, of course, this place, which has an extraordinary history. A lighting director is not an electrician. One or two of them happen to be electricians or used to be electricians, but we are essentially lighting designers. The term lighting director, I think, came from America, but it was adopted here, I think, back in the 1980s. We essentially, we are like a director of photography, but working with multi-camera rather than a single camera. And so, yeah, we design the lighting for television studios, for all sorts of different productions, not just in studios, but sometimes in outside broadcasts and so on. But yeah, the main difference between a DOP and a lighting director is that one lights for one camera, the other lights for multi-camera, but otherwise it's more or less the same job. I would say multi-camera is much more difficult. If you're lighting this sort of setup, single camera, one person in a chair, that's it's somewhat easier than I would suggest than lighting several people in being interviewed, let's say, being shot with cameras from lots of different directions. You've got wide shots, tight shots, and they're all being shot from all over the place. But then the sort of shows that I work on include sitcoms, studio sitcoms, and I'm trying to make those look as much as possible as though they've been shot single camera, where you've got usually the time and the opportunity to get the light exactly as you want it for one particular angle. But that's being recorded as a whole scene at a time, which might be 5 minutes long, 10 minutes long, or whatever. And in fact, we record a whole episode in an evening. And cameras are shooting from every single direction, all different directions, 5 or 6 cameras, wide shots, tight shots, and you can't stop and go back and say, oh, I'd like to do that shot again for lighting, please. So you have to light with lots of compromise, and sometimes you don't get it exactly as you would like to get it, but it's a challenge and it's great fun. I do sitcoms, but I'm very lucky in that I get to do sort of, chat shows and stand-up comedy shows and yeah, a variety of stuff. Yeah, a television studio as opposed to a film stage, let me turn that on its head and I'll say what a film stage is. A film stage is basically a black box, usually soundproofed, in which case it's called a sound stage. But it will have any kind of floor. It could be concrete, it could be wooden. A lot of the old film stages have wooden floors so that you could bang nails into them to hold scenery up. But it's essentially a black box with some sort of grid, but nothing fancy up there, just a metal thing that you can hang things off, and that's all there is to it. Whereas a television studio has to have a perfectly flat floor, usually made of resin, very expensive to lay down, but it has to be capable of tracking a camera across it without any bumps or wobbles. So you don't use tracks in a television studio. You don't have time to do that. All the cameras can move freely wherever they want. You also have all the facilities you need. So you have production galleries, a production gallery, a sound gallery where the sound is mixed, and a lighting gallery where the lights are controlled from, where the cameras are racked. And of course all the other ancillary rooms associated with it, with makeup and wardrobe and some sort of prop storage area, usually some sort of lighting storage area, somewhere where scenery can be put together and assembled and brought in. And most importantly, a flexible lighting grid. That obviously, from my point of view, that's the most important thing. But a film stage, as I was saying, has just nothing up there at all, and you've got to hang every single lamp separately off bars or trussing or whatever you bring in. But a television studio will have lights usually mounted either on motorized bars, which can be lowered, and then the lights can be separately adjusted on those bars, or on monopoles, where each lamp is on a separate pole that runs on a track and can be set at a different height. So the idea being that you can light a set very quickly, which gives rapid turnaround and means that the studio can be used more efficiently. But also, from the lighting director's point of view, it means that you can put the light much more precisely where you need it. And then when things change on the day, you can quickly make adjustments. You can add a lamp if things change and a presenter has to present a piece of the program to a camera over there. When that wasn't planned, then you need a light to come in from that direction. You can quickly do that in a few moments, whereas on a film stage you can't do that. So a television studio is just the most efficient factory for making television programs. A good TV studio has all the facilities that are needed on hand and quickly accessible, even for things like catering, and good sound facilities, well insulated so that you don't hear traffic or aeroplanes, and a good way of moving scenery in and out when you need to. All of those things are important. I think the first studio I worked in when I went freelance was Teddington, and that's a curious place because it looks very old. It's a higgledy-piggledy rabbit was, I should say, because unfortunately it's no longer with us. But it was a rabbit warren of corridors and things not quite matching up. And it had the look, you could see that it had been there for a very long time, and I just wondered what its history was. And when I spoke to a few people there, I was getting slightly confusing answers. And so I started to try and find out what the history of Teddington was. And in doing so, I thought, well, there must be a book about this. There's got to be a book somewhere about the history of television and the history of television studios. And I found, well, eventually I found that there wasn't one, and that nobody had written a book about the history of television studios. There might have been a few little bits written about a particular studio. There's an awful lot written about film studios. I mean, every film studio has got book after book written about it, usually mostly about the films and actors and directors who've worked there, but nothing about television. So I just, on a whim, just started to, put the information together myself, just to find out for myself. And then after Teddington, I started to look at this place, because this had a history that was just as interesting, with a film studio background going through to the early days of ITV. And just finding information partly from old books. I looked for old second-hand books on television. I, of course, looked at the internet, and there were some very interesting websites with little bits of information that I found here and there. And once I actually started to publish it as a website, people started to find it. A few people did, and immediately people were saying, "Oh no, you haven't got that right. No, that's not what happened at all. I was there, and this happened, and that happened." So I started getting people emailing me, and the thing just grew, and it sort of corrected itself with information, and then people started emailing me with anecdotes and photographs and so on. So it was just a fascinating experience, and I had no idea that it would end up being as huge as it became. That was never the intention, but it was just done for my own benefit, really, just to find out about the various studios and also the history of ITV. That's really where it began, because it's a fascinating story going right back to the very early days and the various transitions it went through, with companies losing their franchises and other companies coming along, and all the ramifications of that. So that was all tied in really with the website. In the early 1920s, and I can't remember the exact date, but it was shortly after the First World War, this area around Wembley was turned into an enormous great exhibition to celebrate the glories of the British Empire, really. And as well as the famous stadium with the Twin Towers and the swimming pool, which is now, of course, Wembley Arena, which I think must be the only building remaining from that exhibition now. There were lots of grand pavilions all around, which contained various exhibitions to do with, how successful Britain was in running the world. And this thing was open for a couple of years, and millions of people came along. And when it closed, they were left with this massive site, and people were wondering what they're going to do with it. And I think there were a couple of enterprising filmmakers who said, "We'll take over this corner and turn it into a film studio." And they had lots of ambitious plans, but they just built one relatively small studio, which wasn't very successful. And then somebody else, and I can't remember the names off the top of my head, they took the site over, and I think they built a slightly larger studio. And then it was, oh crikey, was it Fox? No, who was it? It was Fox who took it over then. They then ran the studios for a few years. And then I think it was 1938, they decided that that things weren't quite as good for them in Britain as they thought they were going to be. And they closed the studios down. And I think they carried on making films in one of the other studios, maybe in Teddington or somewhere. But I say studios, there were just only a couple of stages at that point. So the studios closed just before the war. During the war, they were used to make sort of propaganda films, and then reopened after the war. And I think to make a few British films, never particularly successful. I think the last film made here was The Ship That Died of Shame, with Dickie Attenborough starring in it. And that, I think, would have been in about 1954. And then the studios closed. And then, of course, in 1955, they were taken over by Associated Rediffusion and turned into television studios. So in 1955, Associated Rediffusion got the franchise for the London weekday programming, and they were desperately looking for somewhere to make television programs. So Wembley Studios at that time was closed. It had previously been used to make films, but the last film was made there in 1954. So they took it over. I believe it only took them about 6 months to convert them into proper TV studios. So at that stage, there were two stages. At that stage, there were two stages. Sorry about that. So at that point, there were two stages, one of which was divided down the middle, and control rooms were built in that, making two TV studios. And the other one, control rooms were put down the side. And then it was divided into a very small studio and a slightly larger one. So they ended up with 4 studios. None of them very big. I mean, they were. I think the largest. I think Studio 1 was about 2/3 the size of the half studio that we're sitting in now. And so the studios were opened in '55. In '56, the ITV companies were all in terrible financial trouble because they weren't making anything like as much money as they thought they would from advertisements. So they closed Studio 3, and that reopened a bit later on as a tele-recording area, I think. But they did, after a year or two, the finances started to turn round, and then the board of of rediffusion realised that actually none of the studios was quite big enough to do what they wanted to do. And so they set about designing this amazing studio that we're in now. And each half of this, as I was saying, is much bigger than the largest studio, which was one of the converted film stages. And of course, the idea was that you could open the great door in the middle and it would become then the biggest studio in the country and possibly even the world. I don't know. I think at the time it may well have been. But it had to be built as a full, properly equipped TV studio. It wasn't just going to be an empty stage. It had to be run, capable of being turned around, just like any of the other studios. It's interesting to ponder why Rediffusion thought they would ever need a very large studio. And I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that might have come as a bit of an afterthought. I think what they realised they needed was another couple of studios, because they were having to make lots of programmes for the ITV network, not just for London. And these were big popular light entertainment shows like Double Your Money and Take Your Pick and Opportunity Knocks and lots of comedy shows like At Last the 1948 show and what was the other one? I can't remember. But there were a couple of shows that led on to Monty Python and The Goodies and so on. But I think at some point somebody must have said, well, rather than building two, let's have the ability to open the door and make it into one huge one. Because I'm sure they were aware that ATV up at Elstree were making a lot of big, very impressive, spectacular Saturday night shows. A lot of those were partly for the American market, because that was the way that ATV was structured. Lou Grade, who ran ATV, was very much looking at the international market and selling his programs to America. And they had a slightly bigger studio. Well, it was a lot bigger than the stages that were here. So I have a suspicion that they thought, well, we could make some big shows like that as well, maybe. Now, in the event, when these two studios were opened, the door doesn't seem to have been opened very often. There were a few big shows made then, which I'm sure we'll come on to later, but most of the time the door stayed closed and they were used as two separate studios. And they are a good size. Each half of this is a good size for making all kinds of shows. For some reason or other, the perfect size of studio seems to have become one that is about 70 by 90 feet within fire lanes. And that means the actual overall footprint is bigger, because once you add the fire lanes, the overall square footage is a bit bigger than that. I say perfect, but that's the ones at the London Weekend studios, the ones that are now called the London studios, they're a little bit smaller than that actually. And some of the ones all around the country are slightly bigger, slightly larger. But a lot of sets that are built for TV shows fit nicely into that size. You can get a good size audience and so on. Now the two here are a little bit smaller than that, but only a little. And it's not, you can easily fit the kind of shows that I'm talking about into a studio this size without making too many compromises. So each half is a little bit less than 70 by 90. It's about 90, but I think they're only about 60 wide. So it's a little bit less. But we're looking now to see what it is. 55. Yeah, all right then, 55. But that little bit of restriction in width is not a major problem. And it still means you can have a good sized studio audience, and the other end of the studio can have your set for whatever it is, whether it's a panel show or even a sitcom. You could even do a sitcom in a studio this size. You know, you'd have to limit the number of sets slightly. But of course the great thing is, by opening the door, you end up with a studio that is massive and is much, much bigger than the 70 by 90, and that gives you the opportunity to do all kinds of shows. I lit a sketch show in here a few years ago, and we started off with the audience sort of more or less in the middle, looking at the usual row of sketch sets across the front. And then week by week, the scriptwriter's ambition grew and grew, and each week we had more and more and more sets until they extended right round in this area here behind the studio audience. And I think we ended up one week with 8 or 9 big sets with sketches on. And the great thing was, of course, they could be performed live in front of the audience, or in some cases behind the audience, but at least with the audience watching monitors, they could react live to the comedy. So that was terrific, because normally with a sketch show, you've only got room to put 2 or 3 sets in front of the audience, and all the rest has to be pre-recorded, which means that the audience reaction can be a little bit stilted. It's not, or at least the timing of the actors isn't quite the same as it is when you're actually performing to a live audience. So that was great. A sketch show in this studio worked extremely well. The opening of this studio, the big show, was something called An Arabian Night. Is that right? I think it was called An Arabian Night. And obviously somebody decided, well, we've got this great big studio, we need to make the sort of program that nobody has ever attempted before. And so they filled the studio with this extraordinary set, which I've no idea what the actual content of the show was, and I'd never seen any of it. But it involved a huge cast of hundreds, if not thousands of people, and loads of animals, horses. There were horses galloping around and stunt horses that jumped over objects and parts of the set. And apparently these horses, of course, would not be much use on a studio floor with, sliding all over the place. So they had to have special rubber shoes fixed to their feet. And these are some sort of Arabian stallions that had never had been shod before, so they didn't take too kindly to that, I gather. But yeah, this 3 hours live went out from this studio with a huge live orchestra and all sorts of stuff going on. Incredibly ambitious. When the studio first opened, it opened with a big spectacular, but it didn't make that many shows, as far as I can find out, that used the entire studio. There was a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream that I've read about, which utilised the full space, which I imagine must have looked amazing. It had a set with lots of hanging gauzes and lots of, using the huge depth that was available. And the other one was a show called Hippodrome, which was made in 1966 while the World Cup was going on just down the road. And that was an extraordinary mix of circus performers and entertainment acts. So there'd be something like Dusty Springfield and, I don't know, some other famous singer and maybe a comedian. And in between those acts, there would be performing lions and a troop of elephants would come round, and then there'd be, tightrope walkers and things. And all of these, each of these shows was introduced by a big American star of the day. Notably, one of them was Woody Allen, who, what on earth was he doing introducing a show like that, in this country of all places? But apparently the show was incredibly popular, and it was shot using 2 completely separate camera crews. There was the local camera crew that, from the studio here, using the black and white cameras, 1966, remember, this is just before colour took off in this country. And then there was an outside broadcast unit that was based in the UK, but had colour cameras, and they sold programmes to America. And they had their cameras in as well. And apparently they had 2 separate directors, 2 camera crews, two complete different setups, but were all making the same show at the same time. How on earth that worked, I have no idea. I mean, how did the presenters know which way to look? I mean, it sounds like a complete nightmare, let alone all the complications of all these animals and things performing alongside glamorous international singing stars and so on. But that was the summer of 1966, and Hippodrome, I think it was called, yeah. And that was a show that could not be done in any other studio, but that really, made its mark here. I mean, the brilliant part of the design of this studio, and it is quite unique, is this huge door, which goes the full width of the studio and 30 feet up. And it means that when the wall is down, and it's not actually one wall, it's 2 walls separated by a gap of about 1 metre or so. Each door is solid, must weigh several tons, and is completely soundproof. And when it's down, it completely seals with the studio floor. Because, of course, in either of these studios, you could be having live music. And if you've got an interview or a discussion program going on in the other one, you can't afford to hear the music going through the wall. But it's no good just having a wall that is soundproofed. You've got to stop vibration from travelling through the structure of the building. So The walls have an inch gap running all the way around. So the two halves of the building are quite structurally separate. And even the studio floor, if you look at it, it's got a funny little zigzag running along, which means that cameras can run over that zigzag without bumping. But it means that the two parts of the building are not actually touching. So it's quite unique, and it's a very, very clever design. And the motors up top, which lift this enormously heavy structure, as I understand it, they looked around to find some motors that were powerful enough to do that, to winch the massive cables to lift the door. And the only ones they could find were the ones that were being used at that time, or being built at that time for warships, for rotating the gun turrets on warships. And so apparently that's what's up there, warship gun turret motors. Okay, in 1968, the ITV franchise was renewed, and at that time, the two most successful ITV companies, well, arguably the two most successful, were Rediffusion and ABC, and they were making lots of very popular programs. And I think both of them probably assumed that they would get their franchises renewed. There was no reason why they wouldn't. But there was a lot of shuffling around of franchises, and different companies were moved around for the areas that they were responsible for, which I won't go into detail now. But the upshot of it was that they ended up with a new company, London Weekend, which was given the London Weekend franchise. And the existing franchise, the two companies, Rediffusion and ABC, those two were left, both of them were excellent companies, and so they were forced to merge. And so Rediffusion, which was here, had to merge with ABC, which was based at Teddington. Much to the disgruntlement of Rediffusion, they didn't want to close down at all. They thought they were doing a wonderful job. But they merged and formed Thames Television. London Weekend had to then start making programmes back in 1968, ready to go on air. And they, of course, had no studios. And so the obvious thing to do was for them to take these studios over. But as I understand it, Rediffusion were reluctant to sell the site at first to London Weekend. But in the end, they did. And a lot of the Rediffusion staff stayed on and ended up working for the new London Weekend company. They moved in, and they started making programmes like On the Buses is the first thing that springs to mind. There was David Frost was a big cheese early on at London Weekend. So there was Frost on Friday, Frost on Saturday, Frost on Sunday, and there were several dramas too that were made at the time which were very popular. One of which was Upstairs Downstairs. Unfortunately, with Upstairs Downstairs, the launching of that coincided with a strike over colour, and the unions refused to work in colour without being paid more. We can argue how justified that was, but nevertheless, that was their argument. They wanted more money to work in colour. So the first episodes of Upstairs Downstairs were made in black and white, and eventually it was all sorted out. And from I think episode 7 onwards, they were then made in colour as they were always intended to be, and all the glorious costumes and sets were revealed. But no, ITV made quite a few. They made the Doctor in the House comedies, and I'm trying to think, George and Mildred, was that made here? Lots of sitcoms anyway, and a lot of popular shows were made here. Or at the same time, of course, as they were planning their own studio centre on the South Bank. And they moved there, I think it was in 1972. So London Weekend were here from 1968 to 1972. 1972, London Weekend left, and the studios remained empty for a few years because I think there was a local planning requirement that they couldn't be turned into luxury flats or something. And then 1978, the Lee brothers took them over. Now, Lee, they were a couple of gentlemen who ran a lighting hire company, which provided lighting for the film industry and for BBC Outside Broadcasts, amongst others. And they decided that they wanted some studios of their own, start making movies themselves. So they took this site over, and started making a range of films. Not many, but usually year on year there was at least one notable film. So there were things like Quadrophenia and The Elephant Man and Brazil. I mean, Terry Gilliam's amazing film, Brazil, and Time Bandits, that was made here. Even a few scenes from The Empire Strikes Back. And of course, when Lee took it over, it was still a television studio, but they didn't want any of this strange television stuff in it. So all of that was removed. All of the old lighting hoists were removed. All the equipment from the control rooms was removed, and they renumbered all the stages. So they became A, B, C, D, E, in the way of that is more traditional, perhaps, on most film studio sites. So, of course, they had not just these two studios, which they called A and B. The other film studios went back to being film studios again, and they were carried on with the lettering C, D, E, and F, and so on. Okay, back in 1982, Channel 4 was launched. Channel 4 was at the time unique in that it was a TV company that had no studios or facilities of its own. And it had to rely completely on independent production companies to make its programmes. And that was quite different from the BBC or ITV, which made its own programmes. So a lot of independent production companies started to be set up, but of course they needed somewhere where they could make the programmes. And so Limehouse TV was created. There were one or two other little studio centres around, I should mention, like Ewart's, which later became Capitol Studios, and Molinaire, but they're much smaller scale. But Limehouse was set up as a completely new independent studio centre with a couple of good-sized studios, completely staffed by freelancers, or at least not so much freelancers as people who were nicked from from the ITV companies and from the BBC. So they went around particularly looking for young, keen people, the best in their field, and they all were then attracted to go to Limehouse with this brand new, exciting new project. And they helped to design these studios, which were converted out of an existing Docklands warehouse. And famous architect Terry Farrell designed the building, or designed all the facilities, and it immediately became a really fashionable place to make programmes. And a number of very successful shows were made there that went out on Channel 4 in particular. And everything looked absolutely tickety-boo. A lot of money had been given to the company by the London Docklands Development Corporation to help them build these studios, because they were trying to attract businesses into the brand new Docklands, which at that time was still basically Docklands. And it looked as though the business was set to run and expand and carry on being very successful for many years. Then completely out of the blue, they'd only been running for a few years, and the LDDC said to them, really sorry, we've got to compulsorily purchase your property because we're going to build this massive great skyscraper right next to it, and we need that site. And that, of course, was the Canary Wharf Tower. So they were given a lot of money in compensation, apparently. But by then, Limehouse had been taken over by another company called Trillion. And whereas Limehouse was a very successful business, profitable business with a good reputation, from what I read, you couldn't quite say the same about Trillion, which seemed to have various financial problems associated with it for various reasons. I don't know what. Anyway, Limehouse was left in the doldrums for a bit, for a year or two, and they took over a studio at the Trocadero to carry on with a few little shows there. But then they decided they would move in here. And so they took over this site, and all of the lighting hoists and all of the equipment which had been installed in their Limehouse studio had been put into storage in the intervening 2 or 3 years. They were all then brought here and reinstalled here. So all these lighting bars that are above me here, they came originally from the Limehouse studio. And a lot of the original electronic and technical equipment also came from Limehouse. So this then became the new Limehouse. Now by then, of course, a lot of the staff and crew had moved on. They were now freelancers. The whole world of television was becoming more freelance, starting to become more freelance. So I don't know, from what I'm told, it never quite got, the same atmosphere as the original Limehouse. But nevertheless, they made programs here like The Word and various other, Whose Line Is It Anyway, and various other shows like that were that had previously been made at Limehouse, and it became a very successful enterprise for a few years, until disaster struck and Trillian, the parent company, went bust, and everything was, they had to close down. When Limehouse moved in, their parent company decided that they would concentrate on Studio 5, and that the film studios were not really of much use to them. And so those studios were demolished, and the land, with the intention of selling it on, one assumes, but the land actually sat there being unused for 2 or 3 years. It was just rubble, and it was a car park, and which was a great shame, because the studios could have been used. They could have been used by anybody. But what Limehouse did do, however, in demolishing those studios, they then refurbed the sort of rest of the site all around. So the sort of backstage areas here, if you like, those were all constructed by Limehouse. So the sort of scenery dock and the lighting store and those kind of areas, and everything really was built as we find it now, so that this double studio is extremely well served with all the facilities you would ever want. There's decent scenery storage, prop storage, lighting storage, very good canteen stroke restaurant, lots of dressing rooms, everything you'd need, and that was all done in the Limehouse days. Yes, a lot of very successful, very popular mostly Channel 4 shows were done here in the Limehouse days. Food and Drink, Whose Line Is It Anyway? Have I Got News for You actually began here, I believe. And a lot of pop videos were made, including the last performance by Freddie Mercury was filmed here just shortly before he died. Fountain was a small independent facilities company based in New Malden. They running a little studio over there, which was mostly used for Ready Steady Cook. And I think they did 1 or 2 other shows there. They must have, but that was their main sort of income. And they obviously saw this studio was sitting empty, and somebody must have said, "Why don't we buy that and expand?" And so they did. I don't know where they raised the money from, but they did, and they took it over. They kept the other studio on, but they had an enormous task, because the studio, as I mentioned before, all of the equipment had been ripped out, and they had to equip it, and it took months and months of work to fit the studio up again and get it up and running. But I think their clever ambition was to use it mostly, or at least, well, to offer the unique facility of this huge space. And they were really the first company that saw the potential of that, and saw that if you turned this into one great big studio, which of course it can easily be done at the press of a button, take the wall up and there you go, that you could make programs here that simply couldn't be made anywhere else. And so they came in and started making programs like Talking Telephone Numbers and Hearts of Gold, the sort of Esther Ranson show, where somebody was persuaded to come into what they thought was a small room or an office or something, and the door would open, and then they'd be taken through into this most enormous studio with hundreds and hundreds of people in the audience. I mean, a real shock. And then a program would be made all about them and what a wonderful person they are and what they'd done in their lives. Perfect TV stuff. But you did need a massive, great studio to do it in. And all those shows that where people could start, their imagination, program makers, program producers and so on, could come up with new ideas for shows that could only be made in this huge space. So yeah, there were a number of, it started to make its mark in the way that the original designers back in the rediffusion days probably never imagined. But yeah, thank goodness it was here, because then we ended up with shows like The X Factor, because love it or loathe it, it's made a huge impact on British television. The great thing about this studio is that it has enabled program makers to come up with ambitious ideas for programs that, frankly, even somewhere like Studio One at Television Centre it would have felt like a bit of a tight squeeze. And on camera, this studio looks huge. I mean, it does look fantastic. A lot of television studios can look quite big on camera. And often when people go in, they say, oh, isn't it small? But this studio doesn't look small. Even when you come into it, when it's empty, it still looks big. And it looks huge on camera. And that's fantastic because you can really make a program that gives the impression of importance and grandeur and, you know, this is an important show. This is the show you should be watching. Look at all this. Look at all these people. Look at this amazing, fantastic set. You can also stage productions like Test the Nation, which had blocks of audiences all the way around with, you know, with people being questioned, if you remember that show, with, I think they were all sort of different professions, weren't they? And each one was asked different questions on different topics. You can't stage a program like that in a normal sized TV studio. It just doesn't work. And that's great. It gave people the idea, it gave program makers the opportunity to come up with new ideas. This studio is famous now for its live shows, and that's really quite something. I've worked here on a few occasions, not very many, not as often as I'd like, to be perfectly honest. I lit a couple of X Factors a few years ago, covering for Dave Davey. I lit a few Over the Rainbows. I lit a really great fun a sketch show series for Al Murray, or with Al Murray, not for Al Murray, which was great fun. And in a few weeks' time, I'm going to be here lighting a show called Taskmaster, and I'm really pleased to be back. But unfortunately not so pleased that it's in this year with the news that we've all just heard. What's great about this place is that it has a small but dedicated staff, very enthusiastic, very experienced. My goodness, they work on all the top shows. And everyone's really keen to make the place work. I mean, everything's so easy. It's all, as well as the fact that the studio itself is so well equipped and so well designed, you've got everything is to hand. Parking's not great. Getting here is not great. And the surrounding area is not great, although it's a lot better now because now that all the new development has taken place with smart new restaurants and shops and things just a few minutes walk away, that's not so bad. But actually in the building itself, it's a lovely place to work. Yeah, great. What you really get the feeling of here is the place buzzes. It's got a fantastic atmosphere. It's got that great, you don't feel as though you're stuck out in the sticks. You feel as though you're right in the centre of light entertainment in British television. And that partly is because of the people who work here now, but it's also because of the history of the place. And you can't forget that. You know these walls are full of all those fantastic shows that have been made here over the last few decades. The closure, or the news of the closure, came as a huge surprise, certainly to me, and I know to everybody else I've spoken to in the industry. I think it's a real shame that a way hasn't been found to incorporate these studios into the redevelopment of the area. I'm sure there were ways that somebody with a bit of imagination could have done that. You can see how it's happened, and you can understand that from the point of view of a company, a board of directors whose responsibility is to make money, that selling this will make more money than keeping it going. And that's the tragedy, really, of studios being owned by businessmen and not by people who are passionate about television. And so the industry will certainly miss it because there isn't an equivalent. There isn't a big studio that is fully equipped with all the peripheral facilities immediately to hand all around it. And so quite where the programs that are made here will go, I don't know. They'll find a place somehow, but it won't be as good. And I think they will not find it as easy. The program makers won't find it as easy.